"They're going to die out there," murmured Sesk, his reptilian eyes fixed on the human. The council members, all seated in their high-tech observation room, watched with different expressions. Below them stretched the harsh landscape of planet Zor's most inhospitable terrain. Jagged cliffs, blistering heat, and nothing but the most basic resources. The atmosphere itself had enough toxins to put most species into a coma within a few days. The human, however, stood casually in the middle of the wilderness, adjusting the torn sleeve of his shirt as if he were about to enjoy a vacation. "Does he have a plan?" Sesk asked, genuinely curious now. The rest of the council exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew what Zelor was. No intelligent being had survived more than 48 hours without advanced technological assistance. Even their own troops, equipped with climate control suits and breathing apparatuses, barely lasted a week. Yet this human had entered with nothing but the clothes on his back. "I heard humans are more adaptable," said Xerus, the youngest of the council members, hesitantly. "Adaptable, yes," Sesk hissed, not hiding his skepticism. "But this? He doesn't even have a personal shield. He's practically naked to the environment. What do they expect to learn from this?" They watched as the human bent down to pick up a rock from the ground. The display zoomed in, showing him examining it with amusement. He tapped it against another stone, as if testing its strength. Sesk scoffed. "Primitive. Maybe that's the point," Xerus suggested thoughtfully. "Perhaps they want to see how humans handle such conditions without the help of machines." Sesk shot him a disdainful look. "Even if that's the test, it's pointless. There's no surviving Zelor. You last as long as you can, then you break." Silence fell over the council as they watched the human move through the rugged terrain. He had tied part of his shirt around his head to shield himself from the sun, a crude measure that drew sneers from the more advanced species watching. But the human kept going, moving at a steady pace that none of them could quite understand. Hours passed. At one point, the human found a small crevice in a nearby rock formation and began gathering dry sticks and branches. Sesk narrowed his eyes. "What is he doing now?" "Looks like he's making a fire," Xerus ventured, blinking in disbelief. The council exchanged incredulous looks. Fire? The most basic survival technique, yet so outdated that many of them had never even considered it. Why would they? Technology had long surpassed such primitive methods. To see someone using it now was almost embarrassing. "He's not going to last long enough to enjoy the warmth," Sesk muttered, though his gaze stayed fixed on the human, who was now patiently rubbing sticks together. Sparks eventually flew, and soon enough, a small flame flickered to life. The human sat beside it calm, as though the day's challenges had been nothing more than a casual stroll through a city park. As the flame crackled softly, the council struggled to make sense of the scene. "Is it just me?" Xerus began slowly. "Or does he look fine?" "He looks insane," Sesk snapped. "He's not even preparing a shelter for the night. Zor's temperature drops by hundreds of degrees after sunset. Fire won't save him from that." But the human remained by the fire, seemingly oblivious to the deadly cold setting in. Minutes turned into hours, and night began to fall. The temperature plummeted, just as Sesk had predicted. Frost formed on the rocks. Even in their climate-controlled room, the council members could feel the chill through their advanced equipment. Yet below them, the human sat perfectly still. His fire had grown smaller, but it hadn't gone out. He shifted slightly and added more branches, not shivering, not frantic, just waiting. "Maybe it's not just technology they're testing," Xerus whispered. Sesk shot him a glare. What else could they possibly test? Xerus didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the human. Endurance. Endurance? Sesk blinked. Mental fortitude. Maybe humans are proving more than just their ability to survive. Maybe they're showing us how they survive. Not with tools, but with sheer will. Sesk scoffed. Will doesn't protect you from toxins or freezing temperatures. Xerus. It doesn't feed you when there's nothing to hunt, and it certainly doesn't let you breathe air filled with sulfur. Then how do you explain this? Xerus gestured to the screen below. The human was still there, still sitting by the fire, still waiting. For a long moment, the council said nothing. The second day began with an eerie calm that unsettled the council members. Sesk's usual disdain was notably absent as he stared at the screen, watching the human stretch lazily by the remains of his fire. It was as if the previous night's cold hadn't affected him at all. The others were equally bewildered, their eyes darting between the various displays monitoring the harsh environment of the alien planet. "Has anyone run an atmospheric analysis recently?" Sesk finally asked, his voice tight. "There's no way he's breathing that air without a filter." "He's breathing it," Xerus confirmed, tapping the report on his console. "We've been monitoring his vitals from the start. His oxygen levels dipped a bit during the night, but they're stabilizing now." "Impossible. The sulfur content alone should have knocked him out by now," Sesk muttered. The screen zoomed in on the human, who was methodically scavenging through the rocky landscape. He had made a makeshift satchel from strips of his clothing and was collecting various plant materials. Occasionally, he would pick up small rocks, tapping them together as if testing for something. The council could only watch, increasingly confused by his calm, methodical behavior. "Is it possible humans have some biological adaptation we're unaware of?" Xerus suggested, leaning forward in his seat. Sesk scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "To survive this? No species adapts to Zelor naturally. You need layers of protective gear just to survive the toxins, temperature swings, and radiation." But the human below didn't seem concerned about any of those dangers. He wandered over to a jagged cliff face, studied it briefly, then placed his hands on the rock. With a grunt of effort, he began to climb barehanded. "Is he trying to kill himself?" one of the council members blurted out, disbelief clear in his voice. "More like testing himself," Xerus said thoughtfully. "Everything he's done so far seems deliberate. He's made tools, gathered supplies, and now this, climbing without any equipment. He's not just surviving. He's thriving." "Thriving?" Sesk repeated, incredulous. "If that's what you call it, this species is more deranged than we thought." The human's climb was slow and deliberate, each movement carefully measured as he ascended the steep cliff. His hands gripped the rough rock tightly, his boots dug into small crevices, and his face remained calm. The council watched in tense silence, expecting him to fall at any moment. But instead, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the top and pulled himself over the edge with a grunt. The display shifted, showing the human now standing at the top of the cliff, scanning the horizon. He seemed to be calculating something, his eyes narrowing as he took in the alien landscape. After a moment, he crouched down, inspecting a small bush growing between the rocks. Carefully, he plucked a few leaves, sniffed them, and then tucked them into his satchel. Sesk leaned closer to his monitor, his face twisted in disbelief. "Is he foraging on Zelor? For what?" "Maybe he's found something edible," Xerus suggested, his curiosity piqued. Humans are known for their strange eating habits. They consume things other species would consider toxic or lethal. The day continued in much the same way, slow, deliberate movements, gathering supplies, and maintaining his makeshift camp. The sun beat down relentlessly, but the human didn't seem bothered by the heat. At one point, he found a small pool of water and cautiously dipped his fingers in to test the temperature. He didn't drink from it, but used it to cool himself down, splashing the water over his face and neck. By the time the sun began to set, he had returned to his camp, building another small fire with the same steady patience the council had been observing all day. Where other species would be scrambling, panicking, or breaking down from exhaustion, the human seemed almost relaxed. "This doesn't make sense," one of the council members whispered. "His vitals are normal. He's not using any technology, and he's still going. Shouldn't he be suffering from dehydration or hunger by now?" "Maybe he's playing a longer game," Xerus said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Humans are known for their endurance. Maybe he's pacing himself, conserving energy, or maybe he's just too stubborn to realize he's dying slowly," Sesk grumbled, though he didn't seem convinced by his own words. Night fell again and the temperature plummeted. This time, the human was prepared. He had built a small windbreak out of rocks and branches to protect himself from the biting cold. He sat beside his fire, staring into the flames, seemingly deep in thought. The council watched, their confusion growing with every hour that passed. "How long can he keep this up?" one of the council members asked quietly. "As long as it takes, apparently," Xerus replied, his voice tinged with wonder. For the first time in the council's long history of overseeing survival tests, they began to wonder if perhaps the human might outlast the planet itself. On the third day, they were no longer merely observing. They were glued to their seats, waiting for something to go wrong. Surely by now, the human had to be near his limits. No food, no clean water, no technology. No species could endure these conditions indefinitely. But as the sun rose, the human was already on the move again. His campfire was extinguished, his supplies gathered, and he headed toward a nearby ridge with the same steady determination he had shown from the beginning. "He's not stopping," Xerus murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's adapting to everything the planet throws at him." Cesc remained silent, but his narrowed eyes tracked every movement the human made. Something in his rigid posture suggested that while he was still skeptical, a growing sense of respect had started to form. He had dismissed the human's endurance as reckless at first, but now, 3 days in, that judgment was unraveling. The human reached the ridge and stopped, surveying the land below. The council watched as he seemed to scan the horizon for something specific. Without warning, he dropped to one knee and began tracing the ground with his hand. Then, to their shock, he started digging. "What's he doing now?" one of the council members asked, leaning closer to the display. "I have no idea," Xerus responded, equally perplexed. "He's just digging." The human dug for what felt like hours, stopping occasionally to wipe sweat from his brow or examine the soil. The council watched, transfixed, wondering what, if anything, he expected to find. "Has he lost his mind?" Cesc finally said, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. Then, suddenly, the human stopped. He crouched low, looking into the hole, his face lighting up with a strange satisfaction. Slowly, carefully, he pulled something from the ground. The camera zoomed in, revealing a small, withered root, barely more than a tangle of fibrous strands. But to the human, it seemed like gold. "He's found food," Xerus whispered, his eyes widening. He knew where to look. Cesc scowled but said nothing. They watched as the human inspected the root, cleaned it with the hem of his shirt, and cautiously bit into it. His expression showed that the taste wasn't pleasant, but he chewed slowly and swallowed, determined to make use of every bit of energy the root could provide. After finishing, he dug up a few more and stored them in his makeshift satchel. "What kind of species knows how to do that?" another council member muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's been here for days, and now he's foraging like this place is his home." Xerus smiled faintly. "That's the thing about humans, isn't it? You put them in any environment, no matter how hostile, and they find a way. It's not about what they have. It's about what they can do without. Impressive or not, this changes nothing," Cesc snapped, though the sharpness in his voice had dulled considerably. "He won't last much longer, without real resources. Even humans have limits." As the human continued to explore, he stumbled upon a narrow ravine with a small trickle of water seeping from between the rocks. It wasn't much, barely enough to form a puddle, but to the human, it was a treasure. Kneeling down, he scooped the water into his hands, drinking greedily before splashing more over his face. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. "He's been subsisting on practically nothing for 3 days, Xerus said, all creeping into his voice. "No advanced tech, no rations, no environmental controls. This is unprecedented. It's madness," Cesc muttered, though even he couldn't look away. By midday, the human's pace had slowed. The council could see signs of exhaustion creeping in. His movements were less deliberate, his posture slumped slightly. But still he kept going, searching for more roots, collecting rocks and maintaining his fire. The sun was blistering, and the heat shimmered off the rocky terrain, but the human pushed on. As the third night fell, the council watched with bated breath. The human had gathered enough supplies to last another day, but his energy was clearly fading. He built another fire, though this one was smaller and burned lower than the previous nights. He sat by it, staring into the flames, his breathing deep and measured, conserving strength. "Do we end the test now?" one of the council members asked nervously. Seth considered the question carefully, his gaze still locked on the human. He had to admit, this creature had far exceeded their expectations. But before he could respond, a chime echoed through the observation room. "He's reached the time limit," Xerus announced, glancing at the timer on his console. 3 full days, no technology, and he's still alive. The council was silent for a long moment as they processed what had just happened. Finally, Sesk spoke, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "End the test." The screen blinked, and the human's image was replaced by a view of the observation room. The council members sat back in their chairs, still stunned by what they had witnessed. Xerus shook his head slowly. 3 days on Zelor, and he survived with nothing, he murmured. "No one else could have done that. Not without technology," Sesk admitted grudgingly. "It's impressive, for a species we've always considered lesser." The council room fell quiet as they reflected on the implications. The human had proven something that went beyond mere survival. He had shown them what it meant to endure without the crutches of advanced tools or tech. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying revelation of all.